In the middle of a packed luxury restaurant, a powerful CEO began speaking in a foreign language he was certain the young black waitress could never understand, using it to mock her intelligence and humiliate her in front of everyone at the table, confident that the words would pass over her like meaningless noise. But what he didn't realize was that the woman standing quietly beside him understood every single syllable, and the reply she would eventually give would leave the entire room speechless. Before we get into what happened that night, take a moment to tell me where you're listening from today, and if you enjoy stories about dignity, justice, and the unexpected moments when truth wins, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's go back to that evening. The restaurant called Maison Rivière was not a place ordinary people wandered into by accident. Located in the heart of downtown Chicago's wealthy Gold Coast district, it catered almost exclusively to executives, celebrities, investors, and the kind of people who casually spent more on dinner than most families spent on groceries for a month. The room glowed under soft amber chandeliers while the faint sound of piano music floated through the air, blending with the quiet clinking of silverware against porcelain plates. Servers moved through the dining room like shadows, efficient, polite, and trained to remain invisible unless needed. Among them was Alicia Grant, a 26-year-old waitress who had learned that invisibility was often the safest way to survive in a place like this. Alicia had been working at Maison Rivière for nearly 3 years, and during that time she had perfected the careful balance required to serve wealthy patrons without becoming the target of their impatience, their arrogance, or their casual cruelty. Her uniform was always immaculate, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture straight, and her smile calm even on nights when her feet ached so badly she could barely feel them. What most of the customers never knew was that Alicia's life extended far beyond the polished dining room floor. Every morning before work, she attended graduate classes at the University of Chicago, where she was studying classical literature and ancient languages, a passion she had developed years earlier while reading old historical texts in the quiet corners of the public library. Her professors knew her as one of the brightest students in the department, someone capable of translating complex passages of Latin and Greek with the kind of precision that usually took scholars decades to master. But tuition wasn't cheap, and Alicia had responsibilities that stretched far beyond her own education. Her younger brother Marcus was recovering from a serious illness, and the medical bills had nearly buried their family in debt. So at night, instead of studying in quiet academic halls, Alicia carried trays of wine and carefully plated meals to people who rarely noticed the intelligence behind her polite smile. Earlier that evening, she had slipped into the staff locker room during her 10-minute break, pulling a worn paperback copy of Cicero's letters from her bag and quietly translating a few lines in her head, the ancient Latin flowing across her thoughts like a familiar melody. One of the other servers, a friend named Jasmine, had peeked over her shoulder and laughed softly. "Girl, you and those old books," she said. "What language even is that?" Alicia had just smiled and tucked the book back into her locker. "Just something I'm studying," she replied. Minutes later, she was back on the floor, just as the restaurant began filling with its usual Saturday night crowd. At a corner table, near the window, sat Professor Daniel Whitaker, a quiet regular who spent most evenings reading while sipping a glass of red wine, occasionally exchanging polite conversation with Alicia when she stopped by his table. The rest of the dining room slowly filled with wealthy couples, business partners, and socialites, discussing investments and travel plans as though the entire world were their private playground. For a while, the evening moved along smoothly. Orders placed, glasses refilled, plates cleared. But everything changed when the heavy front door swung open and Richard Caldwell stepped inside. Caldwell was the CEO of a powerful technology corporation that had made him a billionaire before the age of 45, and he carried himself with the relaxed arrogance of a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. His expensive tailored suit fit perfectly, his watch glinted beneath the restaurant lights, and the woman walking beside him, a glamorous social media influencer named Lena Hart, looked as though she had stepped straight off the cover of a fashion magazine. The restaurant manager hurried across the room the moment he recognized Caldwell, greeting him with exaggerated politeness before quickly relocating another couple from the best table in the house to make space for the billionaire and his guest. Alicia watched the scene unfold from across the room and felt the familiar tension tighten in her stomach when the manager motioned for her to come over. "You'll be serving Mr. Caldwell tonight," he whispered quietly. "Just make sure everything is perfect." Alicia nodded and approached the table with the professional calm she had practiced for years. "Good evening," she said politely. "Welcome to Maison Rivière. My name is Alicia, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with something to drink?" Caldwell barely looked at her. Instead, he continued speaking to Lena while lazily waving his hand toward Alicia, as though she were simply another piece of furniture in the room. "We'll have the 2010 Bordeaux," he said, glancing briefly at the menu. "And make sure it's properly chilled this time. The last place we went had no idea how to serve wine." Alicia nodded and returned moments later with the bottle, carefully presenting it for inspection before pouring the first glass with practiced precision. Caldwell watched her the entire time, searching for mistakes, while Lena giggled at something he whispered to her under his breath. As Alicia finished pouring the wine and stepped back politely, Caldwell leaned closer to Lena and smiled in a way that carried the unmistakable promise of trouble. "You know," he said quietly, though loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "I studied classical languages in college. Latin, Greek, the whole thing." Lena's eyes widened with interest. "Really? That sounds impressive." Caldwell glanced at Alicia again, a slow smirk forming on his face. "Watch this," he murmured before snapping his fingers to call her back to the table, already convinced that the next few minutes were going to be very entertaining for everyone. Everyone except the waitress he had decided to make the center of his private joke. When Richard Caldwell snapped his fingers, Alicia returned to the table with the same calm professionalism she had shown all evening, stopping beside the booth with her hands lightly folded in front of her apron. Caldwell leaned back in his chair and swirled the dark red wine in his glass, as if preparing for a performance. His eyes flicked toward Lena with a smug smile before he turned his attention back to Alicia. Then he began speaking, not in English, but in Latin. The words flowed slowly and deliberately, the way someone speaks when they want to sound impressive. To most people in the room, it would have sounded elegant, maybe even intellectual. But Alicia understood every single word. Caldwell wasn't quoting poetry or philosophy the way he had implied earlier. Instead, he was mocking her. In smooth Latin phrases, he joked about her being ignorant, about how people like her could never understand educated men, about how servants existed only to serve their betters. Lena laughed softly beside him, assuming Alicia had no idea what he was saying. Around them, the rest of the restaurant continued their conversations, unaware that the elegant language drifting across the table carried such quiet cruelty. Alicia stood still, listening. Years of studying classical languages had trained her mind to translate Latin instantly, each sentence forming clearly in her thoughts. For a moment, she considered simply nodding politely and walking away the way she had done so many times before when customers said things they thought she couldn't hear. Her job mattered too much to risk angering a billionaire. The tips from nights like this helped pay her brother's medical bills and kept her in school. But as Caldwell continued speaking, enjoying his own cleverness, something inside Alicia shifted. It wasn't anger so much as a quiet refusal to accept the role he had already decided she belonged in. Caldwell finished his little speech with a satisfied grin and lifted his wine glass, clearly expecting confusion or silence. Instead, Alicia lifted her chin slightly and answered him in the same language. Her Latin was smooth, confident, and unmistakably fluent. "Those who judge intelligence by status," she said calmly, "often reveal only their own lack of it." For a second, Caldwell didn't react at all. Then his smile froze. Lena's laughter died instantly as she looked at Alicia in surprise. Alicia continued speaking, her voice respectful but steady, explaining that language was meant to share wisdom, not hide cruelty. Then she added something that caused a quiet ripple of laughter from a nearby table. She politely corrected Caldwell's grammar, pointing out that he had used the wrong case in one of his sentences. It was a small mistake, but a humiliating one for someone who had just bragged about mastering the language. The air around the table changed immediately. A few diners nearby had started paying attention now, sensing something interesting was happening. Caldwell's face slowly turned red as the realization settled in. The waitress he had tried to humiliate had just outclassed him in the very subject he used to mock her. Alicia finished with a small professional smile. "Would you like to continue ordering in Latin, sir?" she asked calmly. "Or would English be easier for everyone?" Someone nearby chuckled quietly. Caldwell's hand tightened around his wine glass. Public embarrassment was something he had never experienced before. His wealth and reputation had always shielded him from moments like this. But now he could feel the room watching. Lena shifted awkwardly beside him, clearly uncomfortable. Alicia simply waited patiently, as though nothing unusual had happened. Finally, Caldwell placed his glass down a little too hard. His eyes narrowed as he glanced toward his coat, hanging beside the booth. Then suddenly he stood up and reached into the inside pocket. He searched once, then again. His expression changed instantly. "That's strange," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the restaurant. Conversations began to fade as people looked over. Caldwell checked his pocket again before turning slowly toward Alicia. "My credit card," he announced. "It's gone." The room fell quiet. Then Caldwell pointed directly at her. "You were just standing here," he said coldly. "You must have taken it." The laughter disappeared instantly. Alicia felt dozens of eyes turn toward her at once. Only seconds earlier she had calmly defended herself with intelligence and dignity. Now suddenly she was standing in the middle of a luxury restaurant while a billionaire accused her of theft. And as Caldwell watched the shock spread across her face, a fate-satisfied smile began to return to his lips. For a moment the restaurant remained completely silent, the accusation hanging heavy in the air, while every pair of eyes shifted toward Alicia. The manager hurried over, his face tight with worry, clearly torn between defending one of his best employees and appeasing a billionaire customer whose influence could damage the restaurant overnight. Alicia felt her chest tighten as the room that had been quietly amused seconds earlier now watched her with suspicion. Caldwell folded his arms, the faint smile on his face returning as though he had successfully taken control of the situation again. But just as the manager reached for his phone to call security, a calm voice spoke from across the room. "I believe that won't be necessary." An older man slowly stood from a nearby table where he had been dining alone for most of the evening. His name was Professor Daniel Whitaker, a respected linguistics scholar from the University of Chicago, and he had been quietly observing everything that had happened. Walking toward the center of the room with the calm confidence of someone used to commanding attention, he looked directly at Caldwell. "Your card isn't missing," he said evenly. "You placed it back in your wallet earlier and put the wallet in the inside pocket of your coat." Every head turned toward the jacket hanging beside the booth. The manager stepped forward, reached inside the pocket, and pulled out Caldwell's wallet. When he opened it, the black credit card was sitting exactly where the professor said it would be. A wave of murmurs spread through the restaurant as the truth became obvious. Caldwell's face drained of color, his earlier confidence collapsing under the weight of the entire room now watching him. Professor Whitaker looked at him calmly. "What you attempted tonight was not a mistake," he said. "You tried to humiliate someone who had done nothing but her job. And when that failed, you tried to destroy her reputation." Lena quietly stood from the table, clearly embarrassed, and stepped away from Caldwell without saying a word. Around the room, several people had already lifted their phones, capturing the moment as whispers began spreading quickly from table to table. Caldwell grabbed his coat and rushed toward the exit without another word, his shoulders stiff as he pushed through the restaurant doors and disappeared into the night. For a moment the room stayed quiet. Then someone began clapping softly. Within seconds the entire restaurant joined in, the applause filling the room as Alicia stood there stunned by how quickly everything had changed. The manager approached her with a quiet apology, but Professor Whitaker simply smiled warmly. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace," he told her. "And if you ever need a recommendation at the university, I would be honored to provide one." Alicia thanked him quietly, still processing the night's events. A man who believed language could be used to make someone feel small had tried to shame her in front of a room full of strangers. Instead, it had revealed the truth about him and about her. And as the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Alicia realized something important. Dignity, knowledge, and self-respect were things no amount of money could ever buy, and no amount of arrogance could ever take away.